Hello, everyone, and welcome to 180 Degrees of Impact. My name is Matt Scott, and today I'm joined by Sonja Eliason. Sonja, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. No, thank you for being part of this. And I'm excited to have you, especially because as I look back, the people I've interviewed for 180 Degrees of Impact, unfortunately, I haven't had a ton of current students who are making an impact. And so I'm excited to hear from you, um, especially because I know how tough it could be to balance being a student and all that entails with making an impact. So just as we get started, I'd love if you could, introduce yourself to the 180 Degrees of Impact audience.
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Sonja Eliason. I'm a current junior at Harvard University undergrad, studying human evolutionary biology with a secondary in history. And I joined Circle of Women, which is a nonprofit that I'm currently the co-executive director for my freshman year. Circle of Women is a nonprofit dedicated to increasing access to education for girls in developing countries. And the way that we typically do that is through construction projects for schools that currently exist, but they need something either to accept more women or to provide a better level of education. So we identify these schools, help them figure out exactly what their needs are, and then completely fund the construction process. So that's kind of what the nonprofit is. How I sort of ended up getting there. I arrived at Harvard and didn't know anyone. And so a friend of mine who was a few years older than me in high school, who had a very good friend here, introduced me to someone who was a senior. And she, at the time, was the financial director for Circle of Women. And she and I used to just meet to kind of talk about how to navigate Harvard, different things that I should be aware of coming in, just more general advice. But as I got to know her, I also got to know more about Circle of Women. And I knew going into college that I was going to treat my academics as an intellectual pursuit. So in the very traditional liberal arts method, I did not want to treat college as trade school. I didn't want to study something just because I thought it was going to be giving me some kind of skill for some future career that I didn't even know what that was going to be. So I knew that that was going to be my kind of intellectual major. But what I didn't know was what I was going to do outside of the classroom that was actually going to give me the skills and the experiences that were going to prepare me to enter the workforce in whatever way that was going to be. And there are lots of clubs at Harvard that are very practically geared, so they're investment clubs, they're consulting groups, they're very specific about giving you core skills for the specific industry. And I looked into those and, they're very strong programs and lots of great people. But I realized that this was kind of a cool opportunity to learn on the job. And what was great about Circle of Women is that they were kind of offering me this opportunity to pick up a lot of these same skills, but in the setting of an actual company and in a way that wasn't completely self-focused. So the work that I was doing wasn't just me learning, for the sake of gaining these skills, but I was actually having a purpose in the skills that I was gaining.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear because I relate to that a lot from my experience at GW, George Washington University. In particular, I think of how I spent my time, and there was a lot that was more focused on just getting involved and trying some different things out. Mostly things that were focused on the impact piece. But there was also this piece about not knowing exactly what I wanted to do, so I didn't know how I should spend my time
Mm-hmm.
at GW at all the time. Like I didn't know I would be doing something like 180 Degrees of Impact or
Mm-hmm.
social impact storytelling, so to speak, which is what
Right.
I do full time. So I really relate to your approach, and I'm curious, as you talked about finding Circle of Women
Mm-hmm.
as this organization that sounds to me like it's not like any other student organization I've ever heard of, in that it's this really impactful group.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like getting involved with that?
It was pretty intimidating at first, especially because I was going into the financial role. So the girl Our financial director is always at Harvard for tax purposes and bank and reasons, right? And so they needed to pass on the role to someone who was currently at Harvard. And so in that place, I was kind of in the right place at the right time. Coming into a nonprofit that I knew was run by students, but was 10 years old, very established. They had, a very clear process for how they did things, and had a track record of schools that, portions of which they had literally constructed. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly finding myself, with the keys to the bank account that I knew had the money in it that was going to be going to these schools, I was like, I'm so underqualified for this. Why would anybody trust me with this amount of money? How can I, a freshman in college, actually be responsible for handling these funds that will ultimately help real people go to school? I think the heaviness of the recognition that there were girls who were not currently in school that were going to be able to go to school because of what we were doing was incredible, as much as it was mildly terrifying, to kind of have that responsibility. So it was a steep learning curve for sure. And it was a learning curve in realizing that I was capable of doing this, that it was good that I was doing this, even if I felt underqualified. This work was absolutely 100% worth doing, even in my own insecurity. And it was honestly a lot of fun. I've met some of the women that I respect the most in the world through this organization, and that was true from the day I joined, and it's true now. And they helped me throughout the process, and so I never felt like I was sinking or alone, learning the ropes. But it continues to be something that I have to work harder to be better at every day.
Mm-hmm. Who are some of those women that helped you along the way, and how did you meet them? I think mentors are a critical part of
Absolutely
our success overall, and so I'm really curious how you even found those people.
Sure, yeah. I mean, a lot of the women you notice were already in the organization, right? So there was the old financial director who graduated but continued, to be on the phone with me whenever I needed her, talking about Circle, but she was also actually came back into my life in a huge way when I started looking at jobs my junior year. We also have a board of advisors who are professional women, many of whom, but not all, were part of Circle in their college years and have now, gone on to join the real world. And they have stepped in a huge way in that role as well, helping us understand Circle, giving us context. And there are just certain things that you might not be aware of, running a business as a college student, just because you haven't had as much exposure, and they help to fill in those gaps a lot. The woman who was the executive director when I first joined Circle, so that was a year and a half ago now, she was a phenomenal resource kind of in all aspects of my life. I did not know her at all until the day one that I became the financial director, and her generosity of time, not just with the organization, but also with making sure all of us were individually understood the mission and the process, I think was really invaluable for us at the time, and for me and how I came to relate to the organization.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned it yourself, and I'm glad that you've really, it sounds like, and I know this is something that isn't like gone one day, but you've really gotten over the imposter syndrome, quote unquote, of having an experience that you don't necessarily feel like you're deserving of being in, or at least you're able to be effective, obviously, in spite of that. And so I'm wondering, what were the biggest challenges as you got started running this big, important organization?
What were the challenges? Oh, where do we start? So I'll kind of speak from being executive director, not financial director, since I think those are just entirely different approaches. I was executive director individually for a year, and I've since, as of January, brought on a co-executive director, and I'm more focused on general management now, and she's got a more focus on ethics and strategy. But that's very new, so I'll kind of talk about my experience last year. One thing that I definitely was not prepared for when I stepped into the executive director role was the emotional energy that goes into maintaining chapters. So Circle of Women is a chapter-based structure. So we have the national management team, which is what I'm the executive director of, our board of advisors who have voting privileges and give us advice, but don't actually handle any of the day-to-day. And then we have all of our chapters, and our chapters are college and high school-based chapters. And when you have that many people working as kind of this grassroots fundraising project design base, it puts a huge requirement on you as leadership to make sure that information is being passed through them in a very efficient way. Otherwise, they lose touch with the mission and the actual projects extremely quickly. And if you're not constantly feeding that through this kind of like chain of command, and they're not hearing from one another, people lose investment very, very quickly. And I think as all people who like run nonprofits are aware of, getting young people to care about giving and making a difference is tough, because you need to give a very tangible connection to the difference that they're making. And we make a very active choice not to be on the ground for our projects, for cost-based reasons that I can explain later if you're interested. But that means that we have to make sure that that sense of connection still exists for our volunteers, while recognizing that they cannot actually physically in person see the work that they're doing. And making that happen for, you know, all of our hundreds of volunteers was not something I had thought about as financial director, obviously, because that wasn't my job. So there was this whole like communication barrier and structural considerations we had to make about how we could improve that system. So that was a challenge. I think the other thing in terms of actual projects is that we place an extremely high priority on trust with the partners that we work with, and reliability of communication, and the schools having an extremely high track record for success. And really identifying schools that not only align with our mission, but need something that we can offer, is like a constant discussion process, which is really interesting. And it's great because we learn about all kinds of like wonderful organizations that are making like fantastic differences in their communities. But it can be kind of heartbreaking when someone reaches out to us, and you want to help everyone, right? But I mean, if they're a co-ed school, we've raised our donors' funds with the promise that this is going to girls' education. And so we can't build a co-ed classroom. Or if they're a primary school for girls, we build secondary schools. And that is kind of heartbreaking sometimes, because you just want to help everyone. And like the mission's close enough, right? And drawing those lines as a nonprofit can be really hard.
Yeah, I think but the cool thing about the work that you're doing, and the really interesting thing for me, is that just a few days ago, the last interview I did was with Marilyn Mosley-Gournier, who is the executive director, actually the founder of Educate Girls Now, this phenomenal organization that is doing work to ensure that girls have education in Afghanistan. And so partly through their work, it may result in young boys and young girls receiving education, but the focus is on girls receiving education. And you know, she references the film Girl Rising, and of course there are tons of statistics and stories that I'm sure you have too that speak to the importance of girls receiving education. So I mean, I think people you know, more than ever, I hope, understand why it's so important for you to be focused on, we're here to make sure that girls are able to be educated. By the way, I just saw I froze for a second, but I think we're back.
Yeah, we're good. We're good.
Okay. And so as a follow-up to that, though, I want to ask, you know, you mentioned the partners you work with, and then you also mentioned that, you know, that Circle of Women made the choice not to do work on the ground. And I'd love if you could talk a little bit about that. Do those two pieces relate? And if so, how do the partners really help fill in the gap of, you know, Circle of Women not being there in person?
Absolutely. So the choice to not be on the ground, I'm sure you've heard of this term, voluntourism.
Right.
Right. So, and, you know, like full disclosure, I went on one of these trips when I was in high school, right? You know, I went to India and worked in an orphanage, and I at the time did not recognize the whole context that goes into that. Being where I am now and having learned what I have, when we send someone to one of our projects, right, based on the locations of where they are, we are looking at a minimum of around $3,000 round trip. Mm-hmm. $3,000 for one of these projects is a very large amount of money. And trying to figure out ways that someone who comes into a brand new environment at a school where they probably don't speak the language, where they have very little, unless they've done significant research or have some kind of past experience, have very little cultural understanding. Finding a way to make that as valuable to the school as just giving them those $3,000 is quite difficult. And it's not something we have successfully managed to do. We have had a few members of our organization who have independently traveled to these projects. One woman who was actually at Harvard, I believe, got Harvard to pay for the trip because she actually wrote a thesis that involved this analysis of the school. And we actually had one of our current MT members just spend 3 months at a past project. But that is something that people have to find, funds for independently. In terms of the projects on the ground, since we're not going to be there actually overseeing construction, right? A lot of people ask us, well, how do you know that the funds you're sending are actually being used for what they've told you they're going to be using, which is completely valid. Mm-hmm. So we send funds in like a segmented system, and we require, photos of the ongoing construction and that kind of thing. And we also build a significant, because the actual project development process is so long, we build a significant relationship with these people throughout the process. Okay. And what it actually allows us to do is it's like a filtering system where people who are just as dedicated to their schools are the ones that are willing to go through this process with us. So it ends up filtering itself quite well. But there's always either some kind of manager at the school, or sometimes also a project that we are just about to start in Pakistan. We actually have a third-party nonprofit that's based in the US focused on girls' education in Pakistan, who is working with us and the actual school in Pakistan. And having those extra lines of communication, not only does it mean that someone's on the ground who is communicating with us constantly, it also means that there's someone who's a little bit more knowledgeable about the actual community, a little bit more sensitive to the needs, who's helping design whatever the project is. Because we have to be aware of our own limitations as, people in colleges in America, that we might not know exactly what the best thing is for a school on the other side of the world in a very rural area. And having somebody who is very much aware, and who can make sure throughout the process that we're heading in the right direction is extremely important to us. And that's why we put such a high emphasis on picking the correct partners and making sure we have that very foundational support before we ever begin construction.
I know this follow-up question might be before your time with Circle of Women. It probably was, but maybe you could speak to just how you discovered as college students that doing work that way, like in a way that is especially sensitive and respectful, and considerate of the community, so important. Like, could you speak to that at all?
I mean, I do think I inherited a lot of good ethics from previous MTs about how we go about this. I think there is something inherent about choosing to not be on the ground, that you're going to have to be more sensitive to what they actually need, because it's not as though we can walk in to the school and say, this is what we're doing for you, like we have to be in communication with them. So a lot of it comes out that way. I think a lot of it too is observation. We try to stay up to date on organizations that are doing similar work, and how people or even similarly structured organizations that might be doing different kinds of work. And you see a lot of criticism, right, for people who are working in developing countries, Westerners who come in and think they know exactly what people need. And that's just not what we're trying to do. That is just so completely opposite from our goal of empowering young women here and abroad. We're not trying to reform anyone. We're not trying to change any inherent values. What we're trying to do is give girls what they deserve, provide more access, and, compared to us when we've been so lucky. And I think coming at that from the most understanding place that we can for where we're working is just kind of inherent to what we're trying to do.
That totally makes sense to me, and I think it's admirable that you have that perspective, because I talk with a lot of people who, thankfully, the people I'm interviewing all have a similar approach of wanting to make sure that the work that they're doing is with the community and really
Mhm.
supporting the community, as instead of like a volunteerism approach, for instance, and maybe providing a quick band-aid, or thinking you're providing a quick band-aid when it's
Yeah.
maybe causing more harm than good. Uh, and I'd love to know, just thinking about the piece that you mentioned earlier of working with students on campuses,
Mhm.
how do you engage students? I think that's a question that so many organizations ask themselves, and they don't have an answer. But I figure you might have more insight into someone who could like actually turn to your side and ask someone another
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question. And if we're being honest, it's a constant struggle as well. A few different things. One is that a lot of our chapters get exhausted from fundraising, right? So you have to make sure that for any piece of fundraising you ask a chapter to do, which obviously is a critical part of our organization, we're also giving them an opportunity to connect very intimately with the mission, to remember like why they're doing what they're doing. And typically what that looks like is creating a project of their own. So all of our projects actually start from chapters. Chapters identify a region, they identify a school, they like go through the whole process, and we're helping them throughout the way after they have the idea, and making sure that everything's per guidelines and all of that. But it is coming from them, and that kind of keeps the momentum going, for fundraising and for other awareness events that they might want to do. But the chapter process is so long that that's usually a 1 to 2 year cycle on their part, right? So it feeds itself in a way which is really positive. Something we've done this year, which has been extremely helpful, is instituted a more formal structure for chapters that actually imitates the management team, the national board, a little bit more. Because originally we only had our director of chapters on the management team communicating on a regular basis with our different chapters. But now we actually expect every chapter to have a corresponding director for project development, fundraising, and PR and awareness. And all three of those directors communicate directly with the corresponding MT director. And what that does is it establishes a little bit more of a flatter hierarchy and allows a little bit more idea flow between the chapters, so they don't feel the pressure of constantly coming up with original fundraisers, original PR campaigns, but rather they can share them between one another. And there's not as much fatigue, which is what we see a lot of the time. The initiative to be constantly coming up with these things can be really taxing for students while maintaining classes and stuff. But if you can tell them, this school did X and it was really successful, maybe you want to, then that thinking process is kind of done for them, and you see a little bit more enthusiasm taking it on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I have to say, I really admire the way that you're doing the work and the success that you're having, because like I know from being hyper involved on campus in different organizations that it is really difficult. You mentioned classes, for instance, to get people to consistently show up or prioritize the organization, when at the end of the day, the main reason they're there is to be a student, as opposed to like a full-time job at an organization, at a nonprofit.
Sorry about that email bang at the beginning there. Okay. I quit email, so it shouldn't happen again.
No problem. And I just hit, and the email sound was fine. Like okay. There are always random noises that come up on both ends, and it's recording again now. So I'm actually just going to dive into the question I was getting to as I was segueing through this, which I have to remember now. But okay, we're recording. So basically, I'm curious, just considering all of your experience doing this successfully on campuses where we know it can be difficult at times to get students involved and engaged. Like, what is your advice for others who have organizations to get and keep students engaged, or at least to try your best to get and keep students engaged?
Well, I can speak from a Harvard perspective, I guess. people like to see organization in the sense that they want to know if you are a new organization, right? Let's say you're starting from the ground up. You should be able to walk into the first meeting and tell people these are the directors that you need, or whatever you want to call them, but we could, for now, we'll just call them directors. These are the directors that you need, and this is what they're going to do. Because I think what gives people original buy-in is the idea of control, or responsibility, I guess. And for Harvard students in particular, it's titles, right? So if you can bring people and say, we need a new director of fundraising and we need, a VP of finance, right? And these are things that they can cling on to as ownership in the organization, that goes a really long way. What I've seen be less successful is everyone just kind of in this pot of we're all members and doing this thing. That's very easily how you just get no one doing anything, crowd mentality. But if you're able to divide up the labor very specifically, people end up being a lot more invested. Yeah. Also, if you can tell people what they're going to have gained if they do this, right? It's a huge buy-in. If you could say, for us, it's like easy. You're going to actually be running a real nonprofit. You're going to have a greater understanding of what it takes to complete construction projects abroad, incredible leadership skills, task management, right? All these things. People want to know what they're going to be able to say they did, which sounds very shallow, but it's also just kind of realistic of human expectations, right? And then I would also say it's be very clear about why you're doing the work that you're doing. Because even I have to remind myself on a really regular basis, right? It's so easy to get swamped down in the details. And if you just come in and ask people to start doing a ton of work, they're going to look at you like you're crazy. So you always have to lead with why this is critical and why the work you're doing is actually going to make an impact. Because if, there's this kind of vague, we're going to raise money and then we're going to give it to these people and it's going to be great. It's that just feels... why am I dedicating personal time to that when hypothetically I could just be writing a check and have accomplished the same thing? So it's so what is it about my action that is making this more effective than me just donating to someone who's already doing it? Mm-hmm. That would kind of make sense. And I think also too, there is a kind of natural desire for a lot of people to have an impact even in college, to feel like something is different because they were there. And there are so many good ways to do that through service-based organizations and through impact-based organizations. And it's really easy, at least in my experience, there's always going to be someone who cares too, right? And who is just looking for this. So as much as you can, select for those people who have that innate desire to leave an impact while in college. I think has been kind of our best, those are the best workers we have, right? People who kind of have that innate itch.
Yeah, I think just as a follow-up to that, I'm curious what your, how you would like to make an impact. And it's kind of funny because I recognize that when people would ask me as a student, hey, what are you doing after college? That's a tough enough question. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious, on a broader scale, even beyond your time in college, do you have any idea of what impact you're hoping to make?
Well, I mean, ideally, right, I make millions of dollars and found the next Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and everything's wonderful.
It's going to happen.
Here's hoping.
Yeah.
No, I think what it really stems down to is, you want to leave the world at least a little better than you came into it, right? I want to have known that my presence was net positive than net negative, right? You give more than you take. And that sounds like such a, loser response. And I really don't mean it that way. It's just sort of if you can live your life, and obviously we all have our moments of humanness and that's fine, and it's not coming from this higher place, but it's the ongoing attitude of, if I could just make it a little bit better, mm-hmm. If I could just make this a little more efficient, if I could just help this one person. There's a really, I'm sure a lot of people have heard this, there's this great story about this man walking along the beach and all these starfish have been washed up on the beach. and they're going to dry out in the sun. But there are thousands of them, right? And this old man is walking along the beach and he's throwing one starfish and then the next one into the ocean, throwing one back. And this guy comes up to him and he was like, "What are you doing? There's no point. There are thousands of starfish. There's no way you're going to get all of them. Like, why does what you're doing matter?" And the guy looks at him and says, "It matters to this one." And, sometimes people ask me about the Circle of Women. It's like, there are organizations doing similar things. There are organizations that are much larger. There are organizations that are helping more girls than we do. And it's like, yes, there are. But we have helped the schools that we have helped. And there are girls in school who would not be in school except for what we did. And it matters to those girls. And if I'm only one girl, right? And if I can get one more girl through school, right, that's enough. At least it's enough for me. And I have no idea where that directs to after college. I have not figured that out, but I don't think that kind of desire is going anywhere. So it will fit in somehow, some way in what I do, hopefully in a big way. But I couldn't give you any kind of direct line of vision for that, just as I really couldn't have given you any kind of direct vision when I first arrived at college about how I was going to make an impact while I was there. If I was going to make an impact while I was there, I knew I wanted to. But I don't think we ever really know until the opportunity hits us in the face. And the trick isn't really knowing what it's going to be. The trick is knowing it when it gets there and saying yes.
Mm-hmm. But you touch on something really important. And I think there is another side of it that, but just to point it out is that, through your work and through this experience with Circle of Women, you've been exposed to this amazing thing that's making an impact and the feeling of making an impact. And you're also exposing a ton of other students to that. And I think even beyond just like the work you do as one person and then, affecting the lives of a handful of people, you're also really, I would say, like sparking this spirit of innovation and change making that will hopefully lead to more of an impact from more people. So I really appreciate that. And I'm sure that the girls who are impacted, or even the people who will be affected when, let's say, there are people in the organization in Circle of Women who decide to do something that's not, focused on girls' education. Like,
Sure.
there's this effect that's going to keep going on and on and on, and it's hard to track and see, but it's real. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. And I guess just wrapping up, I want to ask my final question, and some say my favorite question, which is a fun one for me to hear at the end of this. That if your life were a book or documentary, at least as far as you see it at this point, or even based on what you've experienced, whichever works best for you, what would the title be and why?
Okay, well, I'll answer for my life up to this point, right? I'm not sure, ask me in 50 more years, like what my name's going to be.
Right.
I'll come back to it. So I thought about this for a while because I, went back and read your email. I think I would say ripple learning.
Oh.
And the reason I would go with ripple learning is because I think my life up to this point has been largely centered around consumption of knowledge and and as I kind of mentioned earlier, not knowing before each step where I was going to go, but knowing when I was going to take that next step. And I think most importantly, if we're going with this visual of ripples, I'm very home-centered. I have a very strong family core. I would say I have a very strong network of friends. And I think that everything I do, I kind of imagine emanating from that. And every time an opportunity arises, or we can just be really metaphorical here, every time someone drops a pebble, right, that ripple gets a little bit larger and it gets a little bit larger. And so every time I take on a new experience or I go somewhere else, I sort of imagine myself as pushing a little bit farther out, a little bit newer of an experience, a little bit bigger risk. And that's where growth comes from, right? But you're always coming back to that center core, which, is my family and my friends and the people that I really hold most dear, and would consider those people the kind of center of myself. But as I kind of go through life up to this point, it definitely has been like, okay, so let's push this a little bit farther. Let's go a little bit bigger. And I hope that keeps going. I think it's sort of the attitude I approach all things with, but it's definitely worked so far, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's always fun, like talking with like someone like you who is definitely in I'll say like a lot more similar age bracket than like some of the people I interview, because they have like a lot more experience and wisdom to share. But it's fun to talk with you because I relate to that so much. Just this idea of like having a notion of what you want to accomplish and what the title of your book or documentary might be, but then also at the same time, like not really knowing. And I think, someone I interviewed for 108 Degrees of Impact in 2017, her name is Jackie Biederman, and she has a podcast called the Changemaker Podcast. And Jackie said to me that the title of her book or documentary would be something to the effect of, I don't know, but it's okay. Just like we never know how it's all going to turn out and how it'll pan out. But I think it's really awesome seeing your vision. And I'm curious to see, like, in 10 years, well, where I am, of course, I want to know that. But like, I'm curious to see where you are and what you're doing, because all the stuff that you're doing now is really awesome. And I could only imagine it's only going to increase once you have like more time to focus your energy on making the impacts you want to make, rather than like all the classes and
all this other stuff that I also have to juggle.
Whatever, whatever that's all about. But as we wrap up, for people who want to learn more about you and the work you're doing, where should they look? What are the links and different places they should go online?
Sure. Yeah. Well, definitely check out circleofwomen.org. That will give them a lot of information about our organization and what we do, and if they want to get involved. I neglect to have much of a personal network, but follow me on LinkedIn, I guess is the best thing I have to offer there. I should probably grow that in the future. 2018 New Year's resolutions, maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely check out Circle of Women. Anyone who's interested in girls' education or college volunteering in general, more than happy to talk to. I definitely got here with the support of people who had experience, so I'm more than happy to give back in any way that I can.
Awesome. And I really appreciate you giving back in any way that you can. And for those who want to learn more about 108 Degrees of Impact, though, as I always think to myself, I'm hoping you do, because you're watching this interview and by this point you know where to find 108 Degrees of Impact. But the website is www.lets.care and @letsyoucare on social media. And I am on LinkedIn personally, on Twitter, just follow me wherever you can if you want, but it's okay if you don't. So, thanks again for being part of this and for sharing. And I know that you have so much more that you're working on, so definitely looking forward to staying up to date on your LinkedIn and on the website with all that Circle of Women and you are doing.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure.
Awesome. And for anyone who is watching, as I like to say to wrap up these interviews, until next time, keep impacting.